Game backups are, retail games that you own, that you run on your PS5, and then you dump them, which turns them into a backup copy that you can then run without the original game disc. So if the disc ever gets lost or damaged where you're not able to run it, you'll have a backup copy that you can still run on the console to help preserve that game into the future. That is what we're talking about here. Now, I will not be showing you how to create the backups in this video. I'll do that in a future video. This video is just about how to get them installed on the console and everything that you need to know there. There's multiple ways that you can run your PlayStation 5 game backups. You can load them off a USB storage device, like a USB or external hard drive, or you can load them from the internal storage, the internal SSD on the console, or even uninstalled NVMe drive that you have installed into the PS5's NVMe slot. So you could also run your games from there too. Now, it's actually recommended to load them from an external USB storage device, which is kind of counterintuitive, but the reason for that is that most games will run fine from an external drive, whereas there are a handful of games that have problems when trying to load them from an internal drive. So you can have a game that runs perfectly fine off a USB storage device, but then has weird issues when you try to load it on the internal storage, for example. So it's always recommended to at least test the game off an external drive first to make sure it works before trying to move it to the internal storage. The benefits of using a USB storage device is that it's easy to load game backups onto the drive by just plugging it into the computer to load the games on, and then simply plug it into the PS5 to load them, rather than having to transfer them to the internal storage. The downside is that USB drives are much slower than the internal SSD, which can lead to extremely long load times and lag or stuttering in the worst cases during gameplay, while streaming in assets. So to avoid this, you want a drive that's capable of up to 10 gigabit per second over USB. That's the maximum throughput of the PS5's USB ports. So I would recommend something like a Gen 3 NVMe drive with a USB enclosure that's capable of 10 gigabit per second over its USB interface. That will give you enough speed to play PS5 games normally with no issues besides slightly longer loading times when compared to the internal drive. So that's my personal recommendation. Get the fastest external drive that you can over USB in order to avoid issues. We'll start off with the USB drive because that's easier, but I will show you guys how to copy the games to the internal storage and an internal NVMe drive as well. Now, we want our USB storage device to be formatted in exFAT format, so if you right-click on the drive and go to Properties, make sure the file system is exFAT. If it's anything else, you'll need to back up any data on the drive and then right-click and reformat it in exFAT format by selecting the file system as exFAT and reformatting the drive by clicking Start. So once you have the drive in exFAT format, we can right-click in the root of the drive, not inside any existing folders, and create a Homebrew folder here in the root of the drive. This is where we're going to put our backups inside. So I do have a few game backups that I've dumped on my console. So what I'm going to do is try and install a couple different ones to give you an idea of the different formats that game dumps come in. So if we take a look at Resident Evil 9, for example, this is kind of the most common format that you'll find game backups inside, where it's just a folder, and then inside that folder you have all of the raw game files that were dumped, just sitting in that folder. And the folder that contains eboot.bin, that is sort of your main game folder right there. So in this case, it's this PPSA 31246-app. That is our game backup folder right there. So we can copy this over and run it immediately. Now, sometimes the DLC or updates might be in separate folders. In this case, the DLC is in a separate folder here with game files, and then there's also a backport patch with this version to allow the game to run on older firmwares. So, like, I dumped this game on firmware 12.70. However, of course, there is a backport patch to allow it to work on older firmware, so I could get this game back up running on my older 4.03 system with this 4.xx backport. So, because I'm going to be running this on my 12.70 system, I don't need to install the backport patch. But if I was on my 4.03 system, I would need to install that patch as well. Because I want the DLC, I'm going to go ahead and grab the files for the DLC and copy them into the main game backup folder so that you can get the DLC working as well. Now just replace any files in destination. That's all you got to do. It's the same if you want to install a game update. If the game update's a separate folder, then just copy all the files from the game update into the main game app folder as well. And then again, if I wanted to install the backport patch to run it on an older firmware, I would also copy the files here for the backport patch and also paste them into the main game folder as well. That's how you get things like DLC updates and backport patches installed. Usually the backport patch is the thing you install last if you're trying to get it running on an older firmware. So at this point, we can then take the game app folder itself and just copy it into the Homebrew folder on our USB device to get that installed. Okay, so that's one of the formats where it's just the game folder with all of the game files stored inside. The other formats, if I go back to some of my other games, so I've got Red Dead Redemption. This one I have as a single file. So this is the other formats. You'll see it's just a single file. It might be a .ffpfsc like this, or it might be a .xfats or .ffpkg. Doesn't really matter with the file extension. It will just be a single file. So the game dump is inside this file, so you can just copy the single file directly over to the Homebrew folder. Now, of course, I will show you guys how you can convert each type to the other version. So you can convert this single file into the game dump folder the same way we have Resident Evil 9, and I can also convert that game dump folder for Resident Evil 9 into a single file version, so you can swap the different versions around. Now, the other thing with Resident Evil 9 as well is that on this game and some other games with the DLC, you notice some of them also come with a package file. So we have a package file here for Resident Evil Requiem to unlock the DLC, and of course DLC that doesn't require extra data may also just be a package file like this. So if you have any of these .pkg files, then just copy them to the root of the USB drive, not inside the Homebrew folder. Package files go in the root of the drive, not inside the Homebrew folder. So now we can basically just unplug that USB drive and plug it into the PS5. If you're on a standard fat model PlayStation 5, there is a USB Type A port at the front that's mainly for charging the controller. That one's a slower speed USB port, so do not plug the USB drive into that one. Plug it into one of the back USB Type A ports on the console. Those are the higher speed 10 gigabit per second ports, or the USB-C port at the front is also 10 gigabit per second capable. Okay, so on the PS5, we're going to open up the payload manager. Now, you should have all of this stuff installed from the first video, which showed you how to jailbreak the console from scratch. So obviously, we want to have our nano DNS payload running for our internet access, but mainly the ones for running our backups are going to be KStuff Lights. So we're going to run that, and that's going to enable that on the console. And then the one that is going to mount our game backups is going to be Shadow Mount Plus. Again, we installed all of this in the first episode, in the first video, in the playlist. The playlist is linked down in the video description. So we're going to go ahead and run Shadow Mount Plus next. And when we run this, you will see it will detect the game backups, and we just wait a few seconds for it to do its thing. There we go. Resident Evil Requiem detected and Red Dead Redemption detected. And then it goes ahead and adds them for us. So there we go. Red Dead is added, and Resident Evil Requiem is now added as well. And we should be able to load these game backups. So let me go ahead and just try and launch Red Dead Redemption. There we go. It goes ahead and loads no problem. And if you basically wait a few seconds, you'll also notice another thing that will pop up. Right there, KStuff paused while the game is running. KStuff is, of course, the payload that allows us to run our backup, but it does have a performance impact on your games. So whenever you launch a game, Shadow Mount will automatically disable KStuff after a few seconds once the game is launched, so that you can get back some of that performance. You don't have as big of a performance loss while playing your games. That is basically why it does that, and then it automatically re-enables KStuff when you close out of the game. As you can see, the game here is successfully running. So now if I go ahead and close that game, now you may have an issue when you try to launch the game where the game does not launch. Now I've noticed this on my 4.03 system. KStuff seems to be a bit funny on older firmwares. So let me just address this here because I have had quite a few problems. Here's me trying to run the same games on my 4.03 system with KStuff Lite version 1.07, and you can see I just get this CE error whenever I try and launch the games. If you're running into that issue, then I recommend trying a different version of KStuff. There's two other versions that you can try. If you go into the Manage Payload section and refresh the cloud repository, you should have access to all of the payloads in the cloud repository if you're running nano DNS and you're connected to your network, have internet access. So if you're on an older firmware like a 4.x, 5.x firmware, any firmwares that are having that issue, there's two other versions. There's KStuff Lite DR. This is Drakmore's fork of KStuff Lite. You can install that one. And then there's also regular KStuff version 1.6.7, which is a much older version of P stuff. The general idea here is that if you're running into that issue where you're getting these CE errors, you can use KStuff Lite, Drakmore's version, but I've also noticed a problem with this one. This one does allow me to launch the games on old firmwares like 4.03. However, even though I can launch the game, after I close the game, if I unplug the USB drive, the console just immediately crashes and kernel panics, which is obviously not what we want. The only one that I found has been truly stable on the old firmwares is the original KStuff version 1.6.7. I can load that version, and it will allow me to load my game backups with Shadow Mount no problem, and then I can also, of course, unplug the USB drive after I've closed the game, and the console does not kernel panic. If you're on an old firmware like a 4.x firmware, maybe older, then consider using the original KStuff 1.6.7 until some of these issues with the newer KStuff versions are fixed. So anyway, that's my recommendation if you're running into any issues there on older firmwares. If you're on a higher firmware like a 12.x firmware like I am, KStuff Lite seems to work just fine. So anyway, now that we have confirmed that, obviously Resident Evil Requiem had a DLC package to install, so I'm also going to install that by going into my settings, going to the debug settings, going to game, and then we can go down to package installer and install the package, the DLC file. We'll get that installed, and then just wait a few seconds for that to install. It gets added to downloads, and then it should say that it's ready to use once it's done. And there we go, add-on is ready to use, so now we can launch Resident Evil Requiem now. Again, loading this directly off my USB storage device. And there we go, Resident Evil Requiem is running. And if I go into the bonuses, I've got bonus settings, which contains all of the DLC, because the DLC is basically costumes and like weapon skins and stuff for your characters. So I have all of the deluxe edition skins here, the deluxe edition outfits that normally are not available in the standard version. Okay, so what about copying your games to the internal storage or an internal NVMe drive in the console? Well, you have a few different options. You can run the Elf Arsenal payload that we installed in the first video, which is the kind of all-in-one tool set, through a web panel. And if you load that up, you can access it, of course, on the console itself through the shortcuts. But it's better to access it remotely from a computer or another device on your network by grabbing the PS5's IP address, which you can get from the settings under System Software and Console Information. You'll find your IPv4 address, and you can enter that IP address into the web browser on another device with :6969 after it, and that will take you remotely over to the web panel. In there is a file manager with your USB drive on the left and the console's internal storage on the right in the data folder, and you can basically right-click in the data folder and create a Homebrew folder. Once that Homebrew folder is created, you can go into that folder, select your game dump, and then copy it or move it, and that will move it over to the internal storage. However, the reason why I'm not going into too much detail on the Elf Arsenal method is that I think one of the best options right now is to use something else, which is a game compressor. And the game compressor allows you not only to copy games between the internal storage and a USB drive, but you can also compress your games from the folder version into a smaller single file to save space. And you can also convert the file versions back into the game folder as well with this application. So it has some more functions that are pretty useful. So all you need to do is download the game compressor elf file from the repo and copy it over to the root of a USB drive, plug the USB drive into your PS5 once it's copied over, and then you can simply use the payload manager to go over to the settings, make sure Scan USB Payloads is enabled. Then you can go to Manage Payloads and scroll down to the bottom to find the payload and copy it to the internal storage. Once it's copied over, you can then go back to the dashboard section and load the payload. Once it loads successfully, it'll create another shortcut on the home menu for the game compressor, and we can open this up to get access to the web panel. And again, you can also access it through the PS5's IP address on port 5910, using a browser on your phone or on your computer to also access it. So from here, you can see we have our Red Dead Redemption and Resident Evil Requiem. So Red Dead Redemption is the single file, so it shows up as compressed because it is already in the compressed form as a single file. And it says it's not validated. We could validate and repair, which just checks the image file to make sure that there's no bad blocks and that it's overall good and should work. So we could do that if we want. I'm not going to bother. I know this one already works. And then we can also go ahead and copy it. So if you want to copy it over to the internal storage, we can click on the three dots here, and then we have the option to copy to internal SSD or move it to the internal SSD. We can also delete the game from here, and we can even uncompress it back into the raw game folder, like the same format that we have Resident Evil Requiem in. So I'll go ahead and move it to the internal SSD, and that will start transferring. Now, if you have an internal NVMe drive installed in your console, you'll also have an option in that menu to copy or move it to external storage, and if you select that option, the installed M.2 drive should appear in there, and you can select it to copy it to the internal NVMe drive as well, so you can also get it copied over to your internal NVMe drive in the same way. Okay, so once we're done, we can see it's done there. It does do this mounting thing after we transfer, and there we go. You can see it now appears as internal. So we now have the version that is on the internal storage, and because I told it to move instead of copy, it will also delete the original one that was on the USB drive now that it's moved to the internal storage, and it's validated it, and it is all good. Now, going back to problems on older firmwares, I've noticed on my older 4.03 system some issues with the game compressor as well, where a lot of these buttons do not actually function properly on the PS5's browser on older firmwares, but you can get around that again by accessing it from another device using the PS5's IP address on :5910 in your other device's web browser to access it remotely, and then you'll have access to the options there. So anyway, now that we have that copied over, we can also do Resident Evil Requiem. Now this version, as you can see, as a game folder, so it's on the USB drive, is the raw folder with all of the game files, and it's 122.4 gigabytes. So it does give us the option to compress it immediately. So not only can you, of course, move it or copy it to the internal storage, but you can also compress it to turn it into the same kind of compressed version that Red Dead Redemption is in, where it's a single file. We can convert it from a folder into a single file by hitting compress, and then we can either select exFAT, which is the default format. There's also PFS experimental. I'll just leave it on defaults for now. I recommend leaving everything on default, although we can also tell it, since we're going to copy it to the internal storage anyway, instead of compressing in the same location in the USB drive, we can tell it to compress directly to the SSD so that the built compressed version will already be written to the SSD. Once it's done, it will also delete the original after completion. However, I would recommend keeping both versions so that you can at least test to make sure the compressed version works first before deleting your original copy. And then we can tell it to compress the game dump. And there it goes, it starts compressing it on the console itself. So it is going to take some time for it to achieve that. You could just copy the raw folder directly if you don't want to have to wait for compression, but compression will save a significant amount of storage space on your console so that you can fit more games onto your PS5. Okay, so once we're done, we still have the version on the USB drive, but we now have an internal version which is now compressed. So it's on the internal storage, it's compressed, validated, and the size has been compressed down from 122 gigabytes to 77.3, saving 45 gigabytes of space, so you could fit another fairly large game on there with that size savings. So that's the advantage of compression, but sometimes, again, compression can cause issues with certain games, so some games you'll have to leave uncompressed, but other games will work fine when they are compressed. So anyway, at this point, we can go ahead and unplug the USB drive from the console, and we'll see if it just launches directly from the internal storage now. So once we unplug the USB version disappears, but we still have the versions that are on the internal storage now, and we can launch Resident Evil Requiem here, and then eventually we regain signal here, and we're back in the game, and we can click continue to get into the game here, and it will start loading up the game. Loading times are normally a little bit longer with the compressed version, but eventually it should load up here, and we'll get into the game, and the game is running just fine. So that's the general basics on how to get the games compressed and copy it over to the internal storage. And also, if you want to compress the games on the computer instead, then you can use software like FFmpeg Pro, which will allow you to compress the game folder on the PC, and you can do it that way. If your PC is more powerful than your PS5, then it'll compress faster on the computer. And then if you want to copy the games directly from your computer over the network to the console's internal storage instead of using a USB drive to copy them, then you can also use software like PS5 Upload, which has a companion payload to run on the PS5. You can then connect with the software and drag and drop your game dump into the upload section, and then upload it directly to the Homebrew folder in the data folder on the internal storage. So you can also use that software as well to copy your games over. And last but not least, the final thing to mention here is that if you want to delete a game and remove it, do not just delete the shortcut from the home page, because Shadow Mount will just do another scan after a few seconds, and it will detect the game again and re-add it after you delete the shortcut. So you need to make sure you actually delete the game file itself. Either use Elf Arsenal to delete it directly from the Homebrew folder to get rid of the actual game dump itself, or use the game compressor with the 3 dots. It has the option to delete the game data, and then once the game is deleted, you can then remove the shortcut from the home page, and it should be gone for good. So that is how you delete games as well. So anyway, that's going to do it here for this video. That's how you get your PlayStation 5 game backups installed to the internal storage, as well as to external USB devices or internal NVMe drive, as well as how to convert your games from the game folder type to the compressed file version and vice versa. So that is all covered here in this video. So hope you guys enjoyed this one or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a